The morning air was thick with an unfamiliar stench. It wasn't the earthy aroma of dew-kissed soil or the sweet scent of ripening crops that I had grown accustomed to over the years. No, this was something sharp, chemical, and unnatural. My nose wrinkled as I stepped onto the porch, my boots scraping against the wooden planks. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the fields, but something was terribly wrong. My farm, my pride and joy, looked sickly. The vibrant green of my crops had turned a sickly yellow overnight. The leaves curled inward, as if recoiling from some unseen threat. The air carried a bitter tang that made my eyes water and my throat burn. My heart pounded as I sprinted down the steps, my boots sinking into the soil. It was dry, crumbly, and lifeless, nothing like the rich, fertile ground I had nurtured for years. Panic surged through me. This wasn't some freak weather event or a natural blight. Someone had done this. Someone had poisoned my land. My mind raced through the possible culprits, but deep down, I already knew who was behind it. The HOA Homeowners Association had been a thorn in my side for years. They were a group of power-hungry control freaks who had moved into the cookie-cutter neighborhood that had sprung up around my farm. They had been trying to push me out, to enforce their ridiculous rules on my land, even though my farm had been here long before their perfectly manicured lawns. And now, it seemed, they had escalated their harassment to full-blown sabotage. I ran to my barn and yanked open the door to my security system. The cameras covering my fields flickered to life, and as I scrolled through the night's footage, my blood turned to ice. There they were, three figures, dressed in hoodies and gloves, sneaking onto my property under the cover of darkness. One of them carried a large sprayer, while vying it over my crops like some deranged gardener. Another held a jug, pouring something directly into the irrigation system. My stomach twisted into a knot. These weren't just vandals. This was a calculated attack. I zoomed in on the footage, my hands trembling. And then I saw her, Marge Wilmington, the HOA president herself. She stood at the edge of my property, directing the others like some suburban war general. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I had put up with their ridiculous fines, their constant complaints about the unsightly nature of my farm, their never-ending attempts to force me into their HOA dictatorship. But this was a declaration of war. I stood up so fast the chair nearly toppled over. My farm wasn't just my business, it was my life. It was the land my grandfather had cultivated, the soil I had spent years enriching, the fields that had fed not just me, but half the local farmers market. And now, thanks to a bunch of HOA control freaks, my crops were dying. My livelihood was at stake. My patience was gone. I stormed out of the barn and kicked the fence post so hard that a splinter lodged itself in my boot. The thought of confronting Marge and her minions right then and there crossed my mind, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. They would deny everything, play the Tim, and twist the narrative until somehow I was the bad guy. No, this needed to be handled with precision. If they wanted to play dirty, they had no idea just how dirty I was willing to get. I spent the next few hours surveying the damage, testing the soil, and checking my water supply. The chemicals they had used were strong illegal for residential use. If I reported this, the HOA would be in deep trouble. But the problem was, they would just deny it. Even with the footage, Marge was the kind of person who could talk her way out of anything. No, I needed something better. Something undeniable. Something that would make them regret ever stepping foot on my land. As I sat on my porch, staring out at my wilting crops, an idea began to form. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. If they wanted to poison my land, then maybe, just maybe, it was time to return the favor. I pulled out my phone and started making some calls. Within an hour, I had found exactly what I needed: industrial-grade agricultural fans. The kind designed to circulate air through massive greenhouses. The kind powerful enough to send a cloud of chemicals exactly where I wanted it to go. It was almost poetic. They had tried to ruin me with chemicals. Now, I would let those very same chemicals find their way right back to them. Of course, I wouldn't be reckless. I would do everything legally, making sure to use only the same type of herbicides they had dumped on my land. And if the wind just so happened to carry those fumes straight into the heart of their perfectly manicured, HOA-approved paradise, well, accidents happen. The plan was simple but devastating. I would install the fans along the border of my farm, facing the neighborhood. I would wait for the right conditions, a good, strong breeze, preferably when Marge and her crew were out enjoying their pristine lawns. And then, with the flick of a switch, justice would be served. I spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, my mind racing with the possibilities. The thought of Marge's horrified expression as her beloved garden shriveled up was almost too good to be true. The HOA had spent years trying to control everything and everyone around them, but nature wasn't something they could regulate. And soon, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over my wounded farm, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: excitement. This wasn't just revenge. This was balance being restored. The HOA had crossed a line, and now it was time for them to reap exactly what they had sown. The next morning, the industrial fans arrived. They were bigger than I expected, towering pieces of machinery built for greenhouse ventilation. I had paid extra for express delivery, and seeing them up close, I knew it had been worth every penny. The workers helped unload them, giving me strange looks as I signed for the order. I could only imagine what they were thinking. What kind of farmer needed this much industrial-grade wind power? If only they knew. With the fans in place, the next step was setting up the system. I spent the rest of the day running power cables and securing each fan with reinforced stakes to make sure they wouldn't shift or fall. It took hours, but by sunset, everything was in position. The entire setup looked harmless, just a few large fans placed around the farm, as if I were trying to control the airflow for my crops. If anyone asked, that was exactly what I would say. No one could prove otherwise. The final step was preparing the chemicals. I had salvaged as much of the contaminated water as possible, storing it in large barrels that I placed strategically near the fans. The plan was simple. When the wind was just right, I would turn on the fans and let nature take over. A light mist, barely noticeable, would carry the toxins straight into the heart of the HOA's perfect little world. Their manicured lawns, their delicate flower beds, their expensive imported trees, all of it would wither under the same poison they had so generously gifted to me. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 days, the wind refused to cooperate, shifting in unpredictable patterns that made it too risky to start the process. But on the 3rd day, the weather forecast showed exactly what I had been hoping for: a strong, steady breeze moving directly toward the HOA's neighborhood. It was time. I woke up early, checking every last detail to make sure nothing would go wrong. The fans were secure, the barrels were ready, and most importantly, the HOA residents were out in full force. It was the weekend, which meant they were busy tending to their yards, chatting with neighbors, and sipping overpriced coffee while judging everyone around them. Marge Wilmington was right in the center of it all, standing in her perfectly trimmed garden, barking orders at some poor landscaper who looked like he wanted to quit on the spot. The sight of her smug face was all the motivation I needed. I made my way to the first fan, double-checking the settings before flipping the switch. The machine roared to life, blades spinning with a powerful hum. One by one, I activated the rest until all 6 fans were working in unison, creating a steady gust that carried the fine mist exactly where I wanted it to go. Within minutes, the invisible cloud of revenge began drifting toward the HOA's perfect little paradise. At first, no one noticed. The mist was too fine to be seen, blending seamlessly into the warm morning air. But then, the effects began. It started with the plants. The delicate roses that lined the neighborhood entrance started curling at the edges, their once vibrant petals turning brown. The lush green hedges began to wilt, their leaves drooping as if weighed down by an invisible force. The grass, once the envy of every suburban homeowner, started losing its bright color, fading into a dull, sickly yellow. Then came the smell, the same acrid stench that had greeted me the morning after my crops had been poisoned. Now, it filled the air around the HOA. The first screams came from an elderly woman who had been kneeling in her garden, pruning her prized tulips. She clutched her nose, stumbling backward as she called out for help. Within moments, more voices joined in, coughs, complaints, and panicked shouts echoing through the neighborhood. Marge Wilmington was the last to realize what was happening. She stood frozen, watching in horror as her perfect garden collapsed before her eyes. Her prized white hydrangeas turned brown in real time, her ivy-covered trellis drooping like a dying vine. She spun in circles, trying to understand what was happening, until the truth hit her all at once. She stormed toward the nearest group of HOA members, demanding answers, but they were too busy panicking to listen. The first emergency call was made within 10 minutes. Some residents thought they were under attack. Others believed it was some kind of freak environmental disaster. The fire department arrived shortly after, followed by an environmental safety crew. I watched from my porch, pretending to be just as confused as everyone else. When one of the inspectors walked over to ask if I had noticed anything unusual, I played my role perfectly, just a simple farmer who had been minding his business when the wind decided to misbehave. As the chaos unfolded, I took my time shutting down the fans, making sure to do it gradually so it wouldn't look suspicious. The damage had already been done. The entire HOA was in shambles, their perfect world turned upside down by the very thing they had tried to use against me. And the best part? There wasn't a single thing they could pin on me. By the end of the day, the HOA held an emergency meeting, desperately trying to figure out what had happened. Marge was furious, pointing fingers at everyone except herself. But the residents weren't buying it. Some of them began whispering among themselves, questioning whether Marge's actions had finally caught up with them. The neighborhood was in disarray, and for the first time in years, the HOA was powerless. As the sun set, I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of iced tea as I watched the once mighty HOA scramble to clean up their mess. I had spent years being pushed around, fined, and threatened by their ridiculous rules. But now, things were different. They had wanted to play dirty, and they had learned the hard way that when you mess with a farmer, nature always finds a way to even the score. The morning after the incident, I stepped out onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the chaos unfold in the HOA neighborhood. The once pristine lawns now looked like they had been scorched by an unseen force. Flowers that had been meticulously arranged with HOA-approved color schemes were now shriveled, their petals littering the sidewalks like confetti from a funeral. Trees stood lifeless, their branches drooping, leaves crumbling at the edges. The air still carried the faint, acrid scent of chemicals, though most of it had dispersed overnight. The silence from the neighborhood, a stark contrast to their usual morning gossip and garden maintenance, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. I watched as a few HOA members wandered outside, some in their bathrobes, shaking their heads at the destruction before them. Marge Wilmington was at the center of it all, storming up and down the sidewalk, clutching a clipboard as if it held the solution to the disaster. She pointed at different houses, yelling orders to her fellow members, but no one seemed particularly eager to listen. I could tell from her frantic gestures that she was trying to pin the blame on someone, but she was running out of people to accuse. It didn't take long for the first argument to break out. A couple of homeowners, furious at the loss of their expensive landscaping, started demanding answers. They wanted to know who was responsible, why the HOA hadn't prevented it, and whether the association was going to pay for the damages. Marge, cornered and defensive, tried to deflect, insisting that the situation was out of their control. But the residents weren't buying it. They had paid their dues, followed every ridiculous rule, and now, when disaster struck, the HOA had no answers. A few residents even started murmuring about whether it had something to do with the chemicals they had used on my farm. It was just speculation, whispered between frustrated homeowners, but the seed had been planted. One particularly irate man in a golf shirt and khaki shorts pointed out that the neighborhood had never experienced anything like this until the HOA decided to interfere with my land. Another woman agreed, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, nature had a way of fighting back. The look on Marge's face was priceless. For the first time, the control she had clung to for years was slipping through her fingers. By midday, environmental inspectors were back in the neighborhood, taking samples of the soil and air. Marge's desperation grew with each new test, knowing that whatever they found could lead straight back to her. I made sure to stay out of sight whenever they looked in my direction, playing the innocent farmer who had simply suffered alongside them. If anyone asked, I was just as much a victim of the mysterious environmental shift as they were. Then came the INEVY table HOA meeting, hastily arranged at Marge's house. The usual smugness had been wiped from her face, replaced with barely concealed frustration as she tried to regain control of the situation. I wasn't in VY Ted, of course, but I didn't need to be. The shouting was loud enough to reach my porch. The meeting quickly turned into a battleground. Residents were furious, demanding that the HOA take responsibility for whatever had happened. Some wanted answers, others wanted refunds. A few even threatened legal action. The environmental inspectors had confirmed that the chemicals found in the ruined gardens matched those typically used in industrial farming, which only raised more questions about how they had ended up in a suburban neighborhood. Marge tried to steer the conversation away from any connection to my farm, but it was too late. People had started putting the pieces together. Then came the best part. One of the newer residents, a woman who had moved in only a year ago, stood up and demanded to know whether the HOA had been involved in anything illegal. She had overheard rumors that some board members had taken matters into their own hands when dealing with my farm, and now she wanted the truth. Others began nodding in agreement, pressing for answers. The room turned against Marge faster than she could react. Accusations flew, and within minutes, the HOA was no longer united. Members turned on each other, denying involvement, pointing fingers, trying to distance themselves from whatever had been done in the dark. Marge, desperate and flustered, tried to silence the uproar, but it was too late. Someone pulled out a phone, showing security footage of the night they had trespassed on my farm. The footage spread quickly, and soon, the HOA members were forced to face the truth. The very people they had been bullying for years now held the evidence that could take them down. The tension in the room thickened as it became clear that legal consequences were no longer just a possibility, they were on the table. By the next morning, several HOA members had resigned, wanting nothing to do with the mess Marge had created. Homeowners began organizing petitions to dissolve the HOA entirely. Marge, still trying to salvage what little power she had left, made a final desperate plea for control. But the residents had had enough. The HOA, once an iron-fisted entity ruling over every blade of grass in the neighborhood, was crumbling before my eyes. A few days later, official charges were filed against Marge and a couple of her closest allies trespassing, environmental violations, and illegal chemical use. None of it looked good on a homeowner association's record. They would be tied up in court battles for months, maybe even years, while the rest of the neighborhood moved on without them. As for me, I celebrated in the best way I knew how. With the HOA out of my hair, I got straight to work restoring my farm. The land had taken a hit, but nothing that a bit of time and care couldn't fix. I replaced the poisoned soil, planted new crops, and watched as my farm slowly came back to life. The difference was, this time, I didn't have an HOA breathing down my neck, threatening fines for things as ridiculous as excessive natural growth. A week later, I received a letter in the mail from a group of former HOA members. Expecting some half-hearted attempt at an apology, I was surprised to find something completely different. It was an invitation. Without the HOA dictating their every move, some residents had decided to start a small community gardening initiative. They wanted to learn how to grow their own food, how to maintain healthy soil, and how to actually enjoy the land they lived on. And they wanted me to help them. I laughed as I read the letter, shaking my head at the irony of it all. The very people who had spent years trying to get rid of me were now asking for my advice. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let them fend for themselves. But another part knew this was the best kind of not just revenge, but change. They had learned their lesson, and if I could help them see the value of the land rather than just the aesthetics, maybe this whole ordeal had been worth it. That weekend, I drove into the neighborhood for the first time in years, welcomed by the same people who had once treated me like an outsider. The former HOA headquarters had been repurposed into a community space, its oppressive rule replaced with something far more organic. I spent the day teaching them the basics of soil care, laughing as they stumbled through their first attempts at planting something useful. As I drove back home that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. The HOA was gone, my farm was thriving, and for the first time in years, the land was exactly as it was meant to be free. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.